and welcome to Salon Talks. Today, very happy to welcome United States Senator Chris Murphy to our talk. U.S. Senator representing the state of Connecticut. Before that, served in the House of Representatives. And certainly, you know him as one of the primary champions of trying to save lives in our nation from gun violence. Senator Murphy, welcome to Salon Talks. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sure. So, last June, first time in decades, bipartisan gun reform legislation passed. You're a primary sponsor of it. And could you remind people, close the boyfriend loophole, but a few of the main things from it. And then has there been any indication about the impact of it? Has it helped in reducing gun violence in our nation?
Well, great to be with you. First of all, important to understand, how consequential this legislation was. This is the first major gun safety legislation passed by Congress in 30 years. This is a bill that was vehemently, strongly opposed by the NRA and other gun groups, and yet we were able to get significant Republican support matched with Democratic support to get it passed. It had 5 pretty big changes in gun laws. The most notable was support for state red flag laws. These are the laws that states passed to temporarily take guns away from individuals who are in crisis, threatening harm to themselves or others. It closes the boyfriend loophole, as you mentioned. So that means that now everyone that's been convicted of a domestic violence crime in this country will have their guns taken away from them. They can't buy any new guns. It also has a new background check for under 21 purchasers. Unfortunately, you see these mass shooters tend to be, 18, 19, 20-year-old males. Now, there's a waiting period for every young buyer in this country. You can't walk out of a gun store with an AR-15 any longer if you're under 21. There's a more enhanced, longer background check that's done before that purchase happens. Then there's 2 other changes: increased penalties for gun trafficking and straw purchasing, and to interrupt the trade of illegal weapons in this country, and then a requirement that more sellers of weapons that are selling online at gun shows perform background checks. On top of that, there's $15 billion in the bill, and I know nobody knows what numbers are big and small any longer when the federal budget is trillions, but $15 billion is a lot of money to spend on mental health and school safety. Maybe the biggest one-time investment in mental health in this country since the Affordable Care Act, and that money right now is going to schools, community clinics to try to improve access to mental health and help schools become healthier, safer places. So a big deal, more frankly than I thought we could get done. And I'm really proud of the fact that Republicans and Democrats joined together. I've talked too long, but your second part of the question is, has it made a difference? And the short answer is it has. A group of us went out to the National Criminal Background Check System a couple of weeks ago, Republicans and Democrats, and got a briefing. Lots of people have been denied weapons that absolutely shouldn't have them. A lot of young buyers who were in crisis, who were going to buy a weapon, who no doubt were going to use that weapon to either kill themselves or to kill others, have been stopped from getting that weapon because of the law that we passed. And that's just one example of the lives that have been undoubtedly saved already by this legislation.
I think it's remarkable, and it got some press. It deserved more. In fact, the idea that for decades nothing's passed, even after Sandy Hook, even after President Obama literally cried because he was moved so much by the families who had lost children, nothing could pass. There are certain things that people talk about a great deal of the time. You have closing the background check loopholes, that kind of opening there. Maybe what you've done in Connecticut on a state level. The idea of AR-15 ban nationally. But you have a Supreme Court that last year in the Bruin case seems to make it very difficult, if not impossible, to enact legislation to save lives from gun violence. Can something withstand the scrutiny of this far-right court?
Well, that's up for debate. The formal holding of the Bruin decision is fairly narrow about a very specific law in New York. But there's language attached to that decision, very purposefully, very clinically designed to essentially invite district court judges and appellate court judges to bring their politics into the courtroom. What the rest of that decision hints at is that the Supreme Court may rule that any prohibition or any regulation of guns that didn't exist at the founding of this country is unconstitutional. Now, that's absolutely absurd.
Yep.
because many of the weapons that we are dealing with today did not exist at the time of the founding. And there's no way that our founding fathers believed that the Constitution didn't allow you to regulate anything that was invented after the Constitution was passed. But that's what district court and appellate court judges are beginning to do, to say that if it wasn't regulated in the 1780s, it can't be regulated today. And that is a pathway to invalidate, almost all of our gun laws, because any crime that wasn't a crime back then, you can't prohibit people from buying guns if they've been convicted of a new crime that didn't exist in 1780. Assault weapons didn't exist back then, so you can't prohibit those. So we're definitely headed towards a very dangerous place where Congress and state legislatures may be prohibited from passing, many of the common sense gun laws that enjoy broad public support today. That's how radical this court is, and how sort of, and again, I use the word clinical. I mean, they are very purposeful in that, they put out these rulings that are technically narrow, but invite lower courts to engage in, much more sweeping jurisprudence.
And we've already seen an example where they've struck down part of the law to ban people convicted of domestic violence abuse from being able to get a restraining order. You've tweeted something that was really provocative to me, that we have to address the massive explosion of guns in the United States in dealing with gun violence. How do we do that? I agree with you 100%. We have more guns than people in this country. We have more mass shootings in days of the year. It continues. So background checks and banning AR-15 maybe withstands its court, but we have a massive gun issue in the streets and the towns of our nation. What can we do?
Yeah, and I don't really think people understand how big a problem this is and how quickly it has come to overwhelm us. That tweet was accompanied by a chart, and I encourage people to look at it. It was just from a couple of days ago. The explosion of guns in this country is a very recent phenomenon, certainly of the last 15 years, but really of the last 5 years, right? The gun purchase rates, starting in the Obama era, but really supercharged during the pandemic, have meant that there are just exponentially more weapons out there today than ever before. I guess it was sort of hammered home for me by the mayor of Waterbury, Connecticut. The mayor of Waterbury, Connecticut, a guy by the name of Neil Leary, used to be a police chief. Before he was police chief, he used to be a beat cop. And he said, when I started out in the 1980s, it was a big deal if we came across an illegal gun. That was like a big deal. It happened every now and again, but there weren't a lot of illegal guns out there, right? Criminals had them, real hardened criminals. He's like, then about 10, 15 years ago, it started becoming more regular. Every week we would pick up an illegal gun or two as we were stopping people, as we were doing searches. He's like, today, every day, it's like water, it's like rain, right? We come across illegal guns every day because they're everywhere. Detectives in Bridgeport, Connecticut told me the other day, it used to be that a group of kids that were involved in risky behaviors, they'd normally have a community gun. They'd all know where the gun was if they needed it. Now every single kid is armed. Every car has a weapon. And so what happens is every dispute turns into a shooting. Mm-hmm. That same detective in Bridgeport told me, I don't respond to fistfights anymore. They just don't happen. Kids don't have fistfights in Bridgeport. Every beef turns into shots fired. And that is connected to the ubiquity of weapons. So what do we do about it? It's really hard. We can do gun buybacks. That has a pretty narrow scale effect. But this is a problem that we're just living with right now. And we're not talking about, nor will we talk about, gun confiscation. And so you're just trying at this point to stop the problem from getting even worse.
We hear people on the right talk about their concern for children, which is great, but they use it to pass legislation so often to demonize people. Every day, 5, 8, 10 children die by gun violence. And I hear zero concern from them about this. Instead, they want to demonize transgender teens or ban books about Black history in their school because they want to protect children from feeling uncomfortable. What about protecting kids from being shot in their classroom?
Well, and listen, it's not just that. It's if you grow up in a poor neighborhood, in a neighborhood that's prone to violence, like the neighborhood I live in. So I live in the south end of Hartford. I went to go visit my local K through 8 school. I sat down with a group of 8th grade leaders at this school. And they wanted to talk to me about one thing. They wanted to talk to me about their walk to and from school. They wanted to talk to me about how scared they are every day when they leave their house. That trauma, it changes the brain chemistry of children. So it's not a coincidence that all the quote unquote underperforming schools in this country are in the violent neighborhoods. It's because when you are exposed to violence, when you fear for your life, when you're coming to and from school, how on earth can you learn when you're in school that day? And so to me, we can't catalog the epidemic of gun violence merely by how many school shootings we've had or even how many homicides we've had. You have to talk about a generation of kids, specifically in these violence-prone neighborhoods, that we are literally losing because their brains change when they are exposed to warlike levels of trauma. And it is beyond me why Republicans who claim to care about the health of our kids don't seem to give a crap about our children who are being exposed to these epidemic, cataclysmic rates of gun violence.
I agree with you. I wish that I would just like them to be consistent. If they're going to care about kids in the classroom and care about saving their lives from gun violence, it should not be that hard. Instead, it's almost like games. And on some level, to shift gears a bit, I mean, you've had some battles with Ted Cruz. I don't know if you're the Batman and he's the Joker in this and how it works out. But I mean, can you ever reach someone like Ted Cruz on issues like this?
I don't know that I have battles with Ted Cruz. I think, I just tend to ignore him. I mean, he comes to the floor and makes these ridiculous requests. I tend to object to them and then leave the floor, and he yells at me for a while once I'm back in my office, but I'm not sure that they're actual battles. Ted Cruz is sort of looking for confrontation in order to, he's sort of looking for confrontations, opportunities to yell at people, and I just would rather, not give him those opportunities. Here's the good news. I mean, you're never going to get Ted Cruz on a compromised piece of legislation. He's not in the Senate to compromise. He's in the Senate to, to get clicks. Right. But there's plenty of Republicans in the Senate who want to do deals and who want to compromise. And we got that gun bill done last year because Senator Cruz's colleague in Texas, who represents the same constituency that Senator Cruz does, decided that it was better for his state and for our country if we started to work together. And, John Cornyn told me there's a whole bunch of things I cannot do, right? But there's some things I can, and let's focus on the things we can do together instead of the things that we argue over. And that's how we got the gun bill done. So we can continue to make progress, not with every Republican in the Senate, but there are plenty that are at the point where they think part of their job description is to make the gun laws of this nation make more sense.
And shifting gears a little bit, saving lives from gun violence, primary issue of importance, saving our democracy, preserving our democracy going forward, also very, very important. How concerned, I mean, President Biden, I cannot recall another president talking as much about the contest between democracy and autocracy than this president, both foreign and domestically, to be quite blunt. And we see Donald Trump running again, spewing language that you would expect to see from an autocrat in some other nation, not the United States of America. How concerned are you about our democratic republic?
Well, listen, I'm very concerned. I mean, you obviously, still living with the aftermath of a insurrection attempt against the federal government. You have a sizable portion of the country that, is not really interested in preserving democracy. All they want is their people in power. And if democracy doesn't result in their people being in power, then they're not really interested in democracy. I think there's an element of the Republican Party that feels the same thing. There's a strain of thought in the new right that believes democracy is anachronistic, it's irrelevant, it sort of can't keep up with the pace of modern society. And so you need a sort of quasi dictatorship or monarchy instead. So there's a lot of really scary thought that's happening out there. But the American people, had a chance to weigh in on this. They had a whole bunch of candidates running in 2022 that were intent on overturning democracy. And most of them, not all of them, but most of the highest profile candidates who fit that category lost. And Joe Biden showed, an extraordinary kind of leadership. People sort of said, why is Joe Biden making the closing argument about democracy, right? I mean, that's not what's on people's mind. He should be talking about wages, or he should be talking about abortion. He should be talking about something else. Well, there's two kinds of leadership, right? One in which you let others set the agenda and you just fill in the blanks, or you set the agenda. And by Joe Biden elevating the case for democracy and the stakes in 2022 about the future of democracy, I think a lot of voters took cues from the president and came out and voted to preserve democracy. Young people came out in certain states at record numbers, and I think they were coming out in part because they were trying to preserve American democracy. So we certainly still have the threat, but I feel better than I maybe expected to feel after last November.
I remember President Biden getting some pushback on cable news from pundits. Why is he talking about this? I'm like, this is every issue flows from being a democracy or being a republic where democracy is our lifeblood. So I thought it was a great closing argument. Are you surprised that it's 2 years and over 60 days since January 6th and Donald Trump has not faced even one charge for his role in an attempted coup and playing a role, as the January 6th committee said, in inciting the attack on our Capitol?
I mean, I don't provide advice to prosecutors in general.
Right.
I don't do it when it comes to charges against Connecticut citizens. I don't do it when it comes to charges against the President of the United States. So I don't sort of profess any surprise or lack of surprise. That's ultimately a decision that the prosecutorial wing of the federal government will make. Listen, if Donald Trump has clearly violated the law of this country, he should be held accountable. I have been pretty clear, though, that I think it's got to be a pretty open and shut case. I think you got to be careful about charging former presidents of the United States, and I think it's okay to be careful and to make sure that you're going to win that case. So I don't provide advice other than that advice, which is to have a pretty high standard when it comes to bringing criminal charges against former presidents of the United States.
I understand what you're saying. It's although I tweet every day how many days it's been since January 6th to remind people, because I cannot believe, as an American, as also as an attorney, that there's been no charges. And I'm not chanting lock him up. I'm just saying it's accountability to protect our democracy. So last two things, 2022, we expanded in the Senate. We win a seat there, the open seat in Pennsylvania. What's it like on a practical level being in the Senate now with one more Democratic senator?
Well, people don't see some of the practical differences it makes. We could ultimately prevail on the Senate floor because the vice president breaks a tie. The vice president doesn't vote in our committees. So every committee in the prior Congress had equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats. And so, for instance, on the Foreign Relations Committee, when there was an ambassador that Republicans had objected to, it couldn't pass our committee. And so we had to go through a special procedure involving a lot of extra time to get that nomination to the floor for a vote. Well, now we have a majority in all of our committees. And so, yesterday we had a couple close votes, one of which on a nominee to staff a global women's healthcare office that every Republican voted against simply because she was pro-choice. That would have been a tie vote, not advancing out of committee. Now Democrats won the vote and we can take an immediate vote on the Senate floor. So in just practical ways, that extra vote makes a difference. Now, you still got a couple Democrats that in our caucus who are much more conservative and a little bit more resistant to sort of major change, and you got to deal with that in order to get anything passed. But yes, much better to be at 51 than 50.
No, I could see that, and it's great, and things moving, and the confirmation of judges is remarkable, and President Biden setting records, the most Black female judges, more than all the presidents combined. Before that, the judges he's gotten confirmed look like America, as opposed to President Trump and what he had. Very last thing, 2024 is almost here. You've been very strongly supportive of President Biden. Why do you think he deserves a second term?
The proof is in the pudding. I mean, look at this president's record. I mean, you're talking about a 90% reduction in COVID deaths, an economy that is on fire, structurally low unemployment. You have a record of legislative achievement that is unparalleled. I mean, I just don't think you have any other president in our lifetime likely that has gotten as much done in the first 2 years as Joe Biden did. That's improving people's lives, right? Saving lives, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, lower prescription drug costs. And you got a president who knows how to win. I think Donald Trump is going to be their candidate. Maybe I'm wrong. And I certainly want to nominate somebody who knows how to win, knows how to beat Donald Trump in particular. But I also want to reward President Biden for a first 2 years that has been pretty damn successful. It
was historic. The amount of legislation that was passed on issue after issue was great. And then look, the Republicans have the House for 2 months and they passed nothing. They're having hearings about Twitter. That's what
they can't even get. I mean, the crazy thing is that they can't even figure out the easy issues for Republicans. So take the border. I mean, I thought it was going to be easy for them to do something totally irresponsible and draconian and racist. They can't even get their act together on the stuff that they don't need a single Democratic vote for, electing a speaker, passing an immigration bill. So that is really terrible news for the Republic, but it is an advertisement to the American people of how dysfunctional government is if you give it to Republicans these days, at least.
What a contrast. And the only thing they can get together, I just read that the Oversight Committee Chair Comer, because of Marjorie Taylor Greene, they're going to visit the January 6 prisoners in jail.
Sticking up for January 6 protesters and bludgeoning Hunter Biden. That's about all they can agree on.
Last thing, I mean, can you believe the politicalization of the January 6 attack as opposed to uniting us as we were united after 9/11? There is a political partisan agenda to January 6, or is that the times we live in and we should have expected it?
No, we shouldn't expect it and we shouldn't accept it. It just doesn't have to be like this when there's an attack against the United States, whether it comes from foreign terrorists or Americans. We should rise up to defend our nation, period. Stop.
I agree. Well, Senator Murphy, thank you so much for being on Salon Talks. It was great meeting you and fabulous work you're doing on saving lives from gun violence. It's so needed. You're such a clarion call. Look forward to chatting with you in the future.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate having me.